Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Kufbet. Today's daf is sponsored by Dayan Kusher in loving memory of Shimon, Avram, Ben Yisrael, Moshe. Dennis has now gone 4 years. Thinking and remembering and telling stories give us comfort and strength. Okay, we're going to get started with a reminder that we have a siyum coming up. It's Zlat Hashem next week. The siyum will be on Thursday evening at 8:30 Israel time, and make sure to register to get your Zoom link. It'll be a great opportunity to gain some perspective on our Masachet. Okay, we're going to get started. Today's complicated sugya. We're going to continue with it. So what we ended with last time was we had this idea, we had this contradiction between two statements of Rabbi Shimon, or what Rabbi Ashi said, Rabbi Shimon said, and then what Rabbi Shimon actually said. He said, no, it's not a problem. We can keep Rabbi Yosi and distinguish between yesh l'shat kosher and l'shat kosher. And then we said, but wait, what's the story of ein l'shat kosher? Right? If you say ein l'shat kosher, then you're going to have a problem because then you're going to say, right, it's akdishinu b'mechubar, where it was still attached to the ground. And then we're going to say, but you can always just redeem it. And don't we have this concept? This is going to get us off on a complete tangent. On this concept of kola oili padot kepadoi dami, which we see by paraduma. If you can redeem it, it's as if it was redeemed. Once you set up, that's the issue, that you can say that once, right, then we're going to say, okay, well, then why don't we say that by the mincha? And we have a very easy answer. When there's a mitzvah to do it, that's different than when there's no mitzvah to do it. So we're going to look at things, and this is the whole idea that we're going to talk about today. You could potentially do it. It's as if it's already done if we want you to get there. Okay, great. So now the Gemara says, but wait, then you're going to take that to somewhere else, like zrikat adam. Kol ha'ra'oi lizarek kizaruk dami. If the blood can be sprinkled, we look at it as if it's sprinkled. Now that doesn't match the Braita that we saw, because in the Braita, where we saw Rabbi Shimon's position, he said, notar, eino matame tumat ochlin, right? And he explained, lan lifnei zrika eino matame tumat ochlin, but la'achar zrika it is. Now why didn't he say there that, again, if you could potentially do zrikat dam, meaning there was still time in the day, then it's as if it was done, and then it also should be matame tumat ochlin, because again, it was potentially food, because you could have sprinkled the blood and it would have been permitted. To which they have to basically explain, to deal with this good question, I would say, much better question than the answer, that the case must be where you didn't have enough time during the day to do it. And then they said, well, then you should have said that. So they say that is what they really meant to say, even though it's not what they said. But we're going to read that source as if that's what they said, and we have an answer. Now we're going to do something similar with the pigul line in that same Braita. So last line of Kuf Aleph Amud Bet. Ha pigel ben kodshei kodeshim ben kodeshim kalim de mitzvah lemizrukei vi ba'izarek v'katane deino matame tumat ochel. Now pigul, let's just talk about it outside for a minute. Pigul could happen in 2 different stages. You could have a pigul thought and ruin the korban when you're slaughtering the animal. Okay, then it would never be food. Okay, no matter what. Or you could have a pigul thought when you're sprinkling the blood. Now, if you have a pigul thought when you're sprinkling the blood, you had the whole time between shchita. Remember, the animal's can't be food before when it's still alive. But once it's slaughtered, it could potentially be food. But if it's a korban, then it's not. It can't be eaten yet, so it's not called food until you can eat it. But if we say until you sprinkle the blood, which is when you can eat it. If we say that kol ha'ra'oi lizarek kizaruk dami, then if you more mafagel the korban. Now here it says pigul bein b'kosher kosher bein b'kosher kalim. It's not going to be a matame tumat ochlin because it was never food. But what do you mean? If you had a pigul thought at zrika, then after shchita you slaughtered it normally. Theoretically, you could have sprinkled the blood, and we're supposed to sprinkle the blood right in the right way, and therefore that's what it says. The mitzvah lemizrukei after you slaughtered it. You didn't do pigul yet. The pigul was at zrika, according to this. In other words, again, they're assuming it could be pigul b'zrika, pigul b'shchita. Either one should be an option. It doesn't distinguish in the Braita between the cases. So it should be any kind of pigul. And if you were mefagel at zrika, so between shchita and zrika, between the slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood, ibai zarik, if you wanted to, you could have, and you should have done it correctly, not pigul. So therefore, it had a shat kosher. It could have been food then, based on this theory that we go by the potential. V'katane, what does it say in the Braita? De'eno matame tumat ochlin, but it says it's not. So then they say, my lav de pigul b'zrika, shouldn't that include, I already told you this, but shouldn't it include a case where pigul b'zrika also? So they say, lo de pigul b'shchita, just like we limited the previous case to only lan, if it was, only if you slaughtered it just before shchita. Now we're going to say the pigul case is only pigul b'shchita and not pigul b'zrika. If you were pigul b'shchita, it was never rotway because you ruined it before you even turned it into food. Okay, so now they're going to have another difficulty with that, the same kind of difficulty we had in the previous sugya. My love, aval pigul b'zrika mai hachanami de mitami tumat ochlin. Well, if the case is that if you're pigul b'zrika, it is mitami tumat ochlin because kol haro'ei lizarek kizaruk, potential as if it was done. Well, then aditani pigul b'mincha. Again, the language isn't going to work here. What did the Mishnah say? Okay, let's just read. It contrasted two cases. The Braita in the middle of Kuf Aleph Amud Bet contrasted two cases. Pigul, bein b'kosher kosher, bein b'kosher kalam, eino matame tumat ochlin. That's pigul of an animal. Pigul b'mincha matame tumat ochlin. But if it was pigul in a mincha, it would be. Now, if it was really the case that pigul b'shchita versus pigul b'zrika has a different law, and in pigul b'zrika it actually will be matame tumat ochlin because it had a shata kosher, it had a time it was rotway, then don't you think it should have contrasted those two instead of pigul b'mincha? Right? That's what the Gemara is going to say. Aditani pigul b'mincha matame tumat ochlin, since it already contrasted with that case, liflog b'dida, shouldn't it have said like this? When we said pigul is not matame tumat ochlin because it's never really considered food, is only the pigul b'shchita, where it was never food. It went from live animal to disqualified, can't be eaten. Aval pigul b'zrika, where there was a time in between where you potentially could have and should have done zrika properly, mitame tumat ochlin. So why didn't it give that case as the contrast? It would have been a much better case. To which the Gemara says, no, pigul b'mincha yitzrika. They preferred the pigul b'mincha case. Why? Because they wanted to teach you something that you might have gotten confused about. Okay, now afagav the pigul b'kmitza. Now, when does the pigul happen in a mincha? When you do the komets. You take the komets out, and you think, while I'm taking this komets out, I'm going to eat the remainder beyond the designated time, or burn the komets beyond the designated time. Now, this case, let's just think about. We've learned this many times. The actions in a mincha are parallel to the actions in sacrificing, and taking the komets is like slaughtering the animal. Right? They're comparable. So if we say that pigul b'shchita, there is no tumat ochlin, we have to say that pigul b'mincha, there is tumat ochlin, because you would have thought that they're going to say, even though you're pigul b'kmitza and komets b'mincha k'shchita dami, komets is equal to shchita, right? Again, analogy. Komets in a mincha is like shchita in a sacrifice, animal sacrifice. And what do we say in an animal sacrifice? Pigul b'shchita is not going to be b'tamei tumat ochlin because it was never a way to be food. But the mincha is. Why? Well, because a mincha is inherently different. Because it was food before we started, as opposed to a live animal, which wasn't food until we slaughtered it. So that's why it gave that case. And really, in the end, we're now establishing, based on, after these two difficulties from that Braita we saw, we're going to, in the end, say, again, we start with kol haro'ei lipadot kipadoi dami, anything that can be redeemed as if it's redeemed, only though if it's a mitzvah to redeem it. But the corollary to that is that we then can say, kol haro'ei lizarek kizaruk dami, because it's a mitzvah to do the sprinkling of the blood. We look at it, and then we're going to have some cases, even though the Braita seem to say there weren't, we're going to have cases of lan, we're going to have cases of pigul, where there is a shata kosher, because you could potentially have done the sprinkling of the blood, and it was food at that point. But that all is nice and well. Comes Rav Ashi and has a different approach. Okay, I'm a Rav Ashi. I'll just tell you already. He's going to basically say, you can say kol haro'ei lipadot kipadoi dami, but we don't say kol haro'ei lisarek kizaruk dami. And they don't explain, but the commentaries explain what the difference is. But that's what he's going to say. He's going to have a different approach, which then resolves all the problems in that Braita, because then the Braita could be read as simply as it's said, and we don't have to start answering up the Braita in complicated manners. So Amar Rav Ashi, Amarita l'shmata kamei de Rav Nachman. He says, I said this before Rav Nachman, and I told him the following thing: Afilu tema lan mamash. Okay, lan mamash means you left it overnight in a case where You slaughtered it earlier in the day. You could have sprinkled the blood. You didn't sprinkle the blood, okay? And it's lan, even in a case where you didn't sprinkle the blood and it was slaughtered earlier in the day, and there was time where you potentially could have sprinkled the blood. I'm still going to say there's no tumat ochlin. Afilu tema de pigul b'zrika, even if you say the pigul happened to zrika, and again there was that time where you theoretically could have and should have sprinkled the blood. We don't say kol ha'ro'eh l'zarek dami, kizaruk dami. Why? Di'bai parik amrinan. If you wanted to, parik, if you remember, is pidyon, same thing. If you wanted to redeem it, it's like it's redeemed. That we do say amrinan. We say that principle. Ibai zarik lo amrinan, but we don't say, oh, well, since you could have sprinkled the blood, it's as if you sprinkled it. Why not? What's the difference between pidyon and zrika? And this goes back to a distinction we make in lots of things. Okay, if you're doing the Mako challenge, it comes up in Lav She'en Bo Ma'aseh in this week's learning. This is not an action to do pidyon. How do you do pidyon? It's true you take some money, okay, but you could probably do it even without the money and say, I'm redeeming this animal onto money, right? You could say the money's sitting there. You're not actually doing anything. You're speaking. You're saying, okay, I'm transferring the sanctity to that money. But to do Zrika Dam is an action. So when we talk about is something that potentially could have been done already, it's only when it's a light action or light thing, okay? It's hard to call it an action because that's the whole point. It's just dibur. If it's just speech, then we can say, oh, it's so easy to do that we view it as if it's done. But if it's something more complicated, it doesn't matter how complicated the action is, but any action is more difficult to do, so to speak. It's more is required of the person, then we don't say it. Okay? And that's his theory. So we have two theories, and these are what we're going to go with for the rest of the sugya. These two different approaches. Do we say kol ha'ro'eh l'zarek kizaruk dami, or do we not say it? Okay? Everyone agrees about the paraduma, but they don't agree about this zrika issue. So now we're going to have a difficulty on Rav Ashi. Meitiv. Klal amar Rabbi Yosi. Okay, there's a bunch of different girsaot, so if the text in front of you reads a little differently than mine, don't worry. Okay, in the beginning it's not going to be major, it's going to be la instead of lo, but later it's going to be some like real complicated at the end of Amud Aleph, like complete different text, okay, which shows just how complicated the Gemara was, that people struggled to understand exactly how we were supposed to read this. But anyway, let's keep reading. Rabbi Yosi had this principle. This is a Tanaitic source. Kol shaitala shat heter lekohanim ein moalim ba. Okay, now instead of talking about tumat ochlin, we're talking about laws of meilah. And what is laws of meilah? Misuse of consecrated property. And when you have a normal sacrifice, what happens is, after you sprinkle the blood, so the meat becomes permitted either to be burned on the altar, to be eaten by the people, right? There's a heter involved here. Now, let's say it's a shlamim, so we're going to allow the owners to eat the meat. So when does the meat, now, what happens is, or if it's, let's say, let's take a chatat or an asham, where the meat is given to the kohen. So first, it's forbidden to anybody, and it has laws of meilah. No one can use it. As soon as the meat becomes permitted to the kohen, after we sprinkle the blood, then there's no laws of meilah anymore, because the kohen now can eat it. Now, we can't eat it if we're not kohanim or male kohanim, but the meilah is no longer there, okay, because it gets removed when the blood is sprinkled. So now we're going to see why the potential of sprinkling blood is going to be very significant. Because if already potentially the blood can be sprinkled, if we say kol ha'ro'eh l'zarek kizaruk dami, then already the meilah is not going to be there anymore. Okay, so let's see what this says. Kol sha'ayta shat heter lekohanim, if it had a moment where it was permitted to the kohanim, moalim ba. V'kol shelo hayta shat heter lekohanim, moalim ba. If the kohanim never had a moment to eat it, now we're going to talk about something a little more complicated than I said. What if the kohanim could eat it, and then it became impure, and then no one can eat it? So since basically it already had a moment of heter to the kohanim, because it was permitted, let's say we sprinkled the blood, forget about this potential idea. Let's say we sprinkled the blood, and then it was left overnight, and it became notar. So now, basically you have a case where the meilah was removed, and then it doesn't come back. So even though no one can eat it, and if you eat notar, you're going to get karet, but it's not, you don't transgress the laws of meilah, misuse of consecrated property. So that's what they're going to say here. Okay, it had a shat heter lekohanim ein moalim ba. Kol shelo hayta la shat heter lekohanim moalim ba. So there's still meilah if it was never permitted to the kohen at all. Now we want to understand. Ezehu, the Braita says, Ezu shat heter lekohanim. What would be a shat heter for kohanim? Shelana v'shenitmet v'sheyatza. Okay, these are three possibilities. It was left overnight, became notar. It was nitmet, okay, it became impure, and it left the azara. Those are all cases where they're disqualified, but they originally were permitted to the kohanim. What would be a case where it was never permitted to the kohanim? So we're going to say where you piguled it right from the beginning at the shchita when it couldn't have been, right? So it never was food and never was, well, it points here as in food, but it's the same idea. It was never permitted to anyone because it was a live animal and then immediately became disqualified. Or shekiblu psulim v'zarku etama. Or the wrong people, like a balmum, a blemish kohen, took the blood, collected the blood, and sprinkled it. Okay, where again it was never permitted properly. Now, what's the relevant part here for us? Katani mia resha, when it's said in the resha, shelana v'shenitmet v'sheyatzana, there's two possible cases. Either it was, this blood was sprinkled, everything was done fine, and then you left it overnight, and then it became impure, or then it went out, or before also, right? Let's say you slaughtered it, and then never sprinkled the blood and left it overnight. Or before you sprinkled the blood, it became impure. Or before you sprinkled the blood, it was taken out of the azara. Could be both, really, right? And the Braita doesn't distinguish. So that's why they assume meilah lana mamash even before zrika. Now, what do they call this? Could have been potentially eaten by kohanim, even though it couldn't have been. If it hadn't, the blood wasn't sprinkled, it couldn't have been. So this must be based on kol ha'ra'oi l'zarek k'zaruk dami. If you can sprinkle the blood, it's as if you did, because it was a mitzvah to do. Okay? And that's what they're going to say. So that's the contradiction. This, again, doesn't say which case it's talking about, but we assume anytime it doesn't specify if there's two types of cases, either before the sprinkling of the blood, after the sprinkling of the blood, they should have specified. If they didn't specify, we assume at first glance, it's going to include everything, and that's contradiction to Rav Ashi, who said we don't use that principle. So we're going to have two answers, because the first one's not going to work. Lo ru'uya latzed ru'uya latameh ru'uya lalin. What it means is, when it says latzed or lana nitmeh, it means it was ru'uya, meaning everything else was done right. Okay, it's actually a weird phraseology. It was right. It was worthy of getting impure. Okay, there's no such thing as that. No, nothing's worthy to get impure. What it means is everything else was done right, and this is the only thing that went wrong. Okay, meaning you did all the process. You did the slaughtering, the sprinkling of the blood, you're done. And then it became impure, and then it went out, and then, okay, so we're talking about that kind of, we're saying that's the case. Avalana mamash mai. Okay, so now we're going to have a problem if we read it this way. Because you're going to say, lana mamash, so if the blood wasn't sprinkled, hachinami de moalim, then there's going to be meilah, if, right, you didn't sprinkle the blood. If that's the case, and we're basically saying if there was potential right, if there was potential, one second, let me just get it in my head. Lana mamash mai moalim. Okay, we're going to say this wasn't viewed as if, right, it could have been eaten. So the language doesn't work here. Hi, kosha hayala shatater l'kohanim, v'kosha lo haytala shatater l'kohanim. Okay. If we're not going to say that this whole potential, as if it was done, right? If it could have been sprinkled but wasn't sprinkled, we're going to say, okay, it's as if it wasn't sprinkled. The laws of meilah are still applying. Then the language doesn't work. Now, we haven't talked about this before, but the way that we're going to read the languages, they're going to say it should have been talking about present tense. Yesh lo shatater, ein lo shatater. That would be the same. Did it have a possibility to be eaten? Did it not have a possibility to be eaten? Right. Did it have a possibility, a time when it actually could have been eaten? That language should be kosher yesh lo heter or kosher ein lo. It has, okay? Has and now is ruined because you got a tameh, but has meaning it was in existence. Kosher haitalo or kosher, right? So they're going to say the language was, right, should be kosher hayalo and kosher lo haytala or lo haytala. But kosher, but the fact is, it says, right, the language they use is kosher haytala. It had, haytala means it had potential for shat heter l'kohanim. So I'm sorry, I just want to read this better because I think I said in the wrong order. But the Gemara first starts with the language it uses, and since that language isn't right, it should use a different language. Okay, so I'm going to read it again. If you're going to say that lana mamash and the blood wasn't sprinkled, it's meilah because we don't care about potential. Hay kosha haya or haytala shat heter l'kohanim, because lo haytala shat heter l'kohanim. That's a weird language. Hayta sounds like potentially it could have been permitted to kohanim. Potentially it could. It should have said instead kosha yesh la shat heter l'kohanim moalim ba. Because ein la shat heter l'kohanim moalim ba. It should have said if it had or hasn't. Okay, it's a little bit complicated because it's really present tense, and this is actually, it already got ruined. It's a little hard to, you can argue with this language argument, but hayta sounds like potential, yesh sounds like actual. That's the easy way to say it. Yesh and ein, it has, it doesn't have. Okay, so that sounds more like actual. And haytala sounds like it had in potential the capability. So it really does sound like it's kol ra'oi and not the what we said before, what Rav Ashi said, which we don't employ kol ra'oi. It's only if everything else was done like it should have been. And that doesn't sound right. So in the end, Rav Ashi is going to be stuck because he agrees with this argument. And he says, okay, it does sound like in this source of meilah, it does sound like kol ra'oi l'zarek k'zaruk dami. So Rav Ashi comes up with a different answer. Because our topic wasn't meilah, it was tumat ochlin. So he's going to differentiate between laws of meilah and laws of tumat ochlin. So when we started with kol ra'oi lipadot kipadoi dami, and then we could jump from there to also kol ra'oi lizrok kizaruk dami, and then Rav Ashi said, no, I don't hold by that. Well, he's going to say in the world of meilah, yes. In the world of tumat ochlin, no. Okay, because there's a difference for what determines meilah, and there's a difference for what determines tumat ochlin. So that's what we're going to see right now. El Am Rav Ashi, meilah tuma karami. What you're asking me a difficulty from meilah to laws of tuma? Two different things. Meilah mishum kedusha, v'lav kedushahi. Lebatar de paka la kedushate, b'may hadra rachvala. It says meilah all has to do with sanctity, and once there's potential to sprinkle the blood, the sanctity is lowered. And even though now it got ruined because it's yotze, tameh, all that. But the and therefore can't be eaten, but you can't just bring the sanctity back once you lost the sanctity, okay? And what he's basically saying is potential plays a role there because Kedusha is based on potential for, once the kohanim can already sprinkle the blood, right? We already have it in sight that, it's going to be permitted, and therefore, for Kedusha purposes, already the laws of meilah are off the table. And you can't just get them back and say, the Kedusha's back in. It doesn't work that way. But Tuma Mishum Uchla. But Tuma is all about what is food and what is not food. Is this food? Is it not food? V'lav Uchla. It's Mishum Uchla V'lav Uchlahu. Right? It's either yes food or it's not food. Now here's where the Gersa is completely different. Okay? Hecha Zarik. If you sprinkled the blood, Mishavalu Uchla. Umatami Tumat Uchlin. If you sprinkle the blood, then it becomes food, and you can eat it. Hecha de lo zarik if you didn't sprinkle the blood, then lo mashavele uchlin. Then it's not food. Okay? Who cares about potential, right? In the world of Kedusha, metaphysical, you can talk about potential. Could have been. In the world of food, it's either food or it's not food. If you can't eat it because you didn't sprinkle the blood, it's not food. And therefore, he makes this distinction. Again, the first opinion we saw in the Gemara yesterday already doesn't agree with this. But he thinks that there's a distinction. And that's how he deals with this meilah source. Okay, now we're going to have a difficulty on Rav Ashi from a different source. Meitive. So second difficulty on Rav Ashi. Okay, now we're in a totally different topic. Asham talui. What's an asham talui? It's a case where somebody isn't sure. Okay, the classic case they bring is whether you ate chelev or shuman. You ate a piece of fat from a piece of meat. You don't know if it was chelev, the forbidden fats, or the shuman, the permitted fats. So, what do? Well, if you really ate chelev, you bring a korban chatat, but you don't know. So you bring what's called an asham talui, a hanging guilt offering, which is, you bring it, it's going to cover you until such time that you determine whether you really did or not. Now, if you didn't, okay. So, the idea is that you don't want to be walking around thinking that you did a sin, or potentially without getting atonement for it. But you can't get atonement for it with a chatat because you don't know you did it. So there's a special korban, it's a fascinating topic, special korban designed to give you this potential to get atonement in the meanwhile. Why do I say in the meanwhile? Because if you in the end find out that you actually did it, that korban doesn't cover you. It only covers you while you're in this unclear world. But once you determine, okay, in the end I find out it was chaylev, if you ever do. In many cases you may never find out, and the asham talui covers you forever. But if you find out, then you have to bring a sin offering, a regular chatat. Okay, that's the side points about it. Now we're going to talk about someone who brought an asham talui and then finds out that they actually didn't eat chaylev and it was shuman. So while they're at some point in the process, and we're going to discuss the laws in different points of the process, we're going to have different opinions. Only one opinion of one part of the process can be interesting to us, that is relevant to us. That's Rabbi Yosi, which comes at the very end. But we're going to learn this anyway. Maybe asham talui v'noda shelo chatani. Person finds out they didn't sin. Im ad shelo nishchat, if it was found out before they even slaughtered the animal. So all the person did was designate an animal, and then it wasn't slaughtered yet, no dalo, and the person finds out. Yetzev Rebbe Eder Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says it was all by accident that you sanctified this animal. It just goes back, like as if nothing was done, because it was a mistake. Chachamim omrim, turning out on a bet, the rabbis say, Yir'eh ad sheyiste'ev v'yimacher v'yiplu damav l'nidava. The classic, what do you do when you designate a korban and then you don't need it, right? Usually it's, you really did need the korban, but you lost the animal, you found it, right? And you picked a different one and it's dead already. So what do? You leave it to graze till it gets a blemish, because it was really ra'oi for the mizbech. This goes with what we talked about before, about things supposed to go on the mizbech, right? And we can't just remove the sanctity, even though it was a mistake. According to the rabbis, you leave it till it gets a blemish and can't go on the altar anymore, then you redeem it and you bring it as a voluntary offering. Okay, Yimacher, you sell it, Yiplu damav l'nidava, then you just bring a voluntary korban with it. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yikhav, Rabbi Eliezer has a very unique opinion. This matches Rabbi Eliezer in other cases, we're going to talk about in a minute. She has a fascinating opinion, not connected to our topic though, but She'imei no ba'al chet zeh, harei hu ba'al chet acher. Chances are you've probably done something else wrong. And therefore, this will just cover you for something else. That's what asham talui is there for. It's to cover all sorts of mistakes you made. Now, in this case, you had thought maybe you made a mistake, but how many other times maybe you didn't even realize that maybe you made a mistake? So this will cover you for other things. And in fact, that Rashi quotes this sugya in Kritot, which says, Mitnadev Adam Asham Talui B'chol Yom. Okay, and that's Rabbi Eliezer's shita. They say Rabbi Eliezer is consistent with his opinion elsewhere, that I can't remember now if it's you can or you should, okay? But you at least can be mitnadev every day if you want. You can come to the temple and say, I'm going to bring an asham talui. This is a bit of a, overly obsessive person, right? What if I did something wrong? What if I did something wrong? What if I did something wrong? Just bring it every day and cover yourself, okay? Most people don't think that this is the way to go, but he has this unique opinion. Okay, keeping with our sugya though. Misha nishchat nodalo. Stage 2. After you slaughter, then you find out that you actually didn't do anything wrong. Hadam yishafech v'abasar yistaref. The blood gets dumped, the meat gets burned. Okay? Can't do anything with this korban anymore. You stop mid-korban. Nizrak hadam. If the blood was already sprinkled, well then you already did the korban. That was all done properly. Remember, really the zrikat dam is the end. After that, everything else is just extra, right? You're supposed to do them, but the Iyar is done, and you find out, well, I really didn't need to do this. Well, since the blood was sprinkled, habasar yachel, you can eat the meat. Here comes Rabbi Yosi. For Rabbi Yosi Omer, afilu hadam bekos, even if you put the blood in the sanctified vessel already, okay, meaning even if you're standing there with the blood, you're about to sprinkle the blood, and they come and say, oh, you know what? That was shuman, it wasn't chaylev. You don't have to do it. Yizarek, you still sprinkle the blood, v'habasar ye'achel, and the meat gets eaten. Okay, you go ahead. Not like Hadam Yishafech V'Abasar Yisaref. He thinks, no, you go ahead and you continue to bring the sacrifice. V'Amar Rava. Now the question is, what's the basis of Rabbi Yosi's opinion? So here's the problem, because Rava comes and says, Rabbi Yosi b'shitat Rabbi Shimon amara. So Rabbi Yosi holds like Rabbi Shimon da'amal. Kol ha'omed lizrok kizaruk dami. Now he says the reason for this is because once it was potentially able to be sprinkled, the blood, it was as if it was already done, and then it puts it as if you already sprinkled the blood, and if you already sprinkled the blood, you can eat the meat. So basically what we're saying here is, we employ the issue of kol ha'ro'eh lizarek kizaruk dami when it comes to food, because what is it saying basically? The meat can be eaten. So as soon as you slaughter the animal and it could potentially be zrika blood, we look at this meat as it can be eaten because, right, you're going to then in the end go ahead and eat the meat, and then it's food already from that point. And Rav Ashi said that we don't use that term in terms of tumat ochlin. Now, this wasn't talking about tumat ochlin, but it was talking about this determines that the meat can be eaten. So, right, at that stage already, you can say the meat can be eaten. So if the meat can be eaten later, right, then basically it's as if the meat is, now it's a little different, okay, but it still seems to view the meat as food already at that point. So now they say, wait a minute. You're saying that Rabbi Yosi presents a problem because of the way Rava explained Rabbi Yosi. But midi hutama, that's not the reason. Amrei b'ma'arava, mishmei Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, a different Rabbi Yosi. But in Israel, that's ma'arava in the West, they say in the name of Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, hainu tama de Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina explained the reason for Rabbi Yosi not the way we just did. And so the reason why he says this is the Kasavari has a different unique opinion, which is klei sharet mekadshin et hapsulim lechatchila likarev. If you have something in a klei sharet and it becomes disqualified, which is what happened here, the blood was in the cup, and that's why he says afilu adam bekos. It wasn't shchita. If it was kol ha'ra'ui l'zarek, right? Because it would have been from the moment of shchita. He says the blood is in the cup. Why? Because as soon as you put the blood in the cup, it's sanctified. Now, we saw before, sometimes you can say something sanctified and disqualified, but not to let it go on the altar. But, no. This is actually anything in a klei sharet, even if it becomes disqualified, it actually can still be sacrificed. And that's why he thinks this is roket hadam. This has nothing to do with our topic. And with that, we resolved difficulty number 2. Amalei Rav Ashi the Rav Kahana. Now Rav Ashi is going to say in the name of Rav Kahana, last question. Okay, he's going to now question the other opinion. Kol ha'ro'eh l'zarek kizaruk dami works for tumat ochlin. Mida'amar Rabbi Shimon, kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami. Well, then, okay, now he says, I'm going to take you one step farther. Okay, you started with kol ha'ro'eh lifdot kipadoi dami. Then you basically copied that onto kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami in a broad sense, right? Whereas Rav Ashi only said it works for meilah because of that meilah source. But he didn't think it applies. But if you're going to take it and apply it there, and you talk about potential is like actual, well, I'm going to then take this one step farther for you and raise a big problem. Because then you could also say, kolo me lisrof kisaruf dami. Anything that's supposed to be burned because it's disqualified is as if it's burned. Now, food, you take food and you say, well, this food's supposed to be burned. And we say, because it's supposed to be burned by a mitzvah, right? We're going to view it as if it's burned. Then is it food? No, it's afra ba'alma, right? Like that's a term we use by chametz on Pesach, right? When we do bitul, right? We say it's like afra ba'alma. It's not even food. It's not even chametz. So if something's supposed to be burned, then notar, then we have a problem with the braita that we saw before. Because what did we talk about in the braita? There was notar and there was para, okay? Why are these metami tumat ochlin, right? The para because it could be redeemed. The notar because it could be in the case where there was enough time in the day, okay? Why would they be metami tumat ochlin? Notar and paraduma are both things that by mitzvah they're supposed to be burned, right? Whatever's left that you didn't eat on time, you're supposed to burn. The paraduma is meant to be burned by Torah law. So they are afra ba'amaninu and they shouldn't even be called food. It's a great question, right? And it's taking his statement of kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami, and therefore it potentially had a time to eat. But it also was supposed to be burned. And if it was supposed to be burned, it can't possibly be called food. So Amalei, the answer that they answer is, Rav Kahana answers, Chibat HaKodesh Mechashartam. The reason why the Makabel Tumah is really not because they're called food. It's because of this Chibat HaKodesh. We had it with the Eitzim and the Levona, right? Even though they're not food, because they're used for, right, in the notar, it was the sacrificial meat before it became notar. And in the case of the para, it's the para aduma itself is a sanctified item. Because of Chibat HaKodesh, because they're used in Kedusha ways, so that already, the love of the Kodesh, that already gives it, what makes something susceptible to impurity? Significance, okay? That's why food, until it gets liquids on it, isn't susceptible to impurity, because without washing it, it's not ra'oi, right? You take a potato out of the ground, if you don't wash that potato, right, it's filthy, it's disgusting. So until liquid gets upon it, it's not, right? And if it's attached to the ground, it's also not food yet, right? It has to be significant. So it could be because of tumat ochlin, it could be because of chibat HaKodesh. So he says, Chibat HaKodesh is what makes it susceptible to impurity. But Amrle Ravina le Rav Ashi. Ravina says to Rav Ashi the following: Nihida mahanyala like Chibat HaKodesh leifsule degufe lekruye tami nami lemimne be rishon v'sheni. You have to add some words. Mi mahanyale. So he says this Chibat HaKodesh you're saying is what basically makes this potential to carry on Tumah. Now, Tumah can mean two things. Tumah means this became Tameh and is disqualified. But it also can mean that it passes on impurity. That it could be, right, if it's an Ava Tumah, it's going to make something a Rishon. If it's a Rishon, it can make something a Sheni. It can pass on impurity as well. So we said if you're saying Chibat HaKodesh Mechashartan, then these things should be, right, anything in this category that maybe isn't yet food or maybe won't become food, but because of Chibat HaKodesh, it's Mechashartan, it makes them potentially able to carry on impurity. Then not only does it become disqualified, but because of impurity, but also it should be able to carry on, right, to Rishon and Sheni and Matami, other things. In that case, so why is that an issue? Well, Tivsho, to buy Rish Lakish, then you should have answered this question very easily that Rish Lakish had that he didn't know how to answer, which is, Sarid Shal Menachot. If Chibat HaKodesh really works, and you don't always need in Kodshim for it to be food, determined as food, then you don't need this whole Uchshar L'Kabel Tum'ah. Okay, now you have this case of, that could be potentially passed on impurity even if it doesn't get liquid on it. So a mincha, why is it susceptible to impurity? Well, again, Chibat HaKodesh, or because the water came upon it and turned it into food, right? So the water comes on the solet, meaning the liquid. What's the liquid? In this case, it's the oil. It doesn't always have to be water. When you mix the oil with the solet, it becomes susceptible to impurity. Rish Lakish asks, but what if there was some flour in the bowl that didn't get any oil on it? That's a tzarid. Okay, a dry, like tzarud is when your throat is dry. A tzarid is a dry piece of flour that didn't get oil on it. He asked, is it monim bo rishon v'sheni or ein monim bo rishon v'sheni? Okay, we could see maybe it becomes tamei, but does it have the potential? Because those are two different things. They have the potential to pass on, to make something a rishon, make something a sheni. He asked that question, didn't know the answer. Now he says, if you say, Chibat HaKodesh Mechashartan, this is Chibat HaKodesh, it was solet in a klei sharet, should be important enough that it should pass on impurity even to a rishon and sheni. To which he says, Ki mebayale l'rish lakish deoraita, ki kamrinan de rabbanan. He says, when I say Chibat HaKodesh Mechashartan, I meant only on a rabbinic level. On a rabbinic level, Chibat HaKodesh Mechashartan, and then it would be tamei. Okay, that's only a rabbinic law. On a Torah level, that's what Rish Lakish's question is. Rish Lakish wants to know by Torah law where to pass on. Obviously, by rabbinic law, the rabbis restringed and said, Chibat HaKodesh Mechashartan, and therefore it's going to be completely impure. But don't ask me a question about this Rish Lakish's question, because Rish Lakish was talking on a different plane. He wanted to know, by Torah law, would that be the case? Not, okay, there's always an important reason to distinguish between Torah law and rabbinic law, even though practically speaking it's going to be tamei anyway. But, right, it's going to be matame, something rishon sheni, but that might be only on a rabbinic level, not on a Torah level. And that's what Rish Lakish was asking, so don't ask me that question. Okay, now we're going to move on. Let's just summarize before we move on, because it'll be harder to summarize after when our head's already somewhere else. But our basic topic today was this issue of the correlate, that if you say kol ha'ro'eh lipadot kipadoi dami in a case of a mitzvah only, do you then say it also in the case of kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami, because that's also a mitzvah, right? Whereas even Rav Ashi, as a difficulty, took it to this place, kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami, right? But how far do you take it, or do you even take it at all there? Rav Ashi thinks you don't take it to kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami, whereas the other position, the mainstream position we saw, did take it that way. Okay, and then we have difficulties on both of those approaches. If you say it, if you don't say it, how do these sources fit in? So in the end, we resolved all the difficulties, but there were a lot of difficulties, and the resolutions might have been a little weak here and there. But in the end, we have these two approaches, whether you say it by kol ha'ro'eh lizrok kizaruk dami or not. And even within Rav Ashi, who didn't say that, he had to admit that it was true for laws of meilah, just not laws for tumat ochlin, and we had that interesting distinction between what brings kedusha to something versus what makes something food or not food. Those are two different areas, and the criteria might be different. Okay, now we're going to start a whole slew of, which we can continue into the next chapter as well, of vows. Vows that you make about the temple, what I said, and what if, okay, in this case, it's going to be what if I did something different than what I said. Ha'omer hare alai. And the main thing you have to always remember is there's a difference between hare alai, hare zo. Usually the difference, right, we call them neder, nidava. If you say on me, then you have a responsibility. If something goes wrong, you have to bring a new one, right? Like let's say you say, I'm going to bring an animal, and then you don't, right? I'm going to bring korban ola, and then the animal you designate gets sick or dies or something, then you have to bring a different one, okay? If I say hare zo, this animal will be for a korban, and something happens to the animal, I don't have to bring anything else because I did what I was supposed to. I mean, I said this one, and this one's no longer there. I'm not responsible anymore. But that's not exactly the focus of today, but it is something always to remember the distinction. Okay, Homer hare alai b'machvat vevi b'mercheshet. B'mercheshet vevi b'machvat. I said, I'm going to bring a mincha in a machvat. And then I brought in a mercheshet. Remember the flat pan, the deep pan. B'mercheshet vevi b'machvat, or the reverse, doesn't matter. Mashe evi v'yidei chovato lo yatsa. Okay, you didn't fulfill your obligation because you brought the wrong type mincha. However, you brought another one. Probably you were just bringing some other neder you made, okay? Or you just decided to bring another one. We view it as, okay, you brought another korban. But your original one, you didn't fulfill your original vow. You're going to have to bring a new one. So, what if you say zo? I said, I'm going to bring this isaron, this solet is going to be for a machvat. Lavi b'machvat, right? Zo lavi b'machvat. But then you brought as a marcheshet, that exact flour. B'marcheshet vevi b'machvat harezo psula. So you've disqualified it because you can't say it was a different vow. I was talking about this and this I brought. So it's completely disqualified. Ha'omer hare alai shnei esronim lavi b'kli echad vevi b'shnei kelim. You say, I'm going to bring two esronot, actually it says esronot, two 2/10 of an ephah in one vessel. But you brought it in two vessels. Now what's the problem? So Rashi points out the problem is like this. If you bring it in two vessels, you're going to have to do two separate kmitzas. And if you brought it in one vessel, you do one kmitza on the 2/10. Okay, so the amount of komets, you're now going to have two kmitzas, so you're going to burn two things rather than you said you were only going to burn one. And your mincha, all the proportions are off because now you have less shirayim and more komets. You're not allowed to add or deduct from what you were supposed to do. So that's basically a major problem. But if you said hare alai again, we can just assume it was a different korban, but but if you said these in one vessel and then hivi b'shnei kelim or b'shnei kelim hivi b'kli echad, okay, either way you're going to have everything off because you're going to do one kmitza instead of two, or you're going to do two kmitzas instead of one. Both of those are going to be problematic. Hare elu psulim. So if you said these, then it's obvious that was what you meant for that vow, and they're disqualified. That was really the same thing, just in a different case. Hare alai shnei esronot. Now we're going to get a little different. It's similar to the previous. You said, I'm going to bring two esronot, lavi b'kli echad in one vessel. So far it's the same as the previous. Vehivi b'shnei kelim. And you put it in two vessels. But then, this is new, amrulo b'kli echad nadarta. They say to you, but wait, you said you were going to do it in one vessel. Now, what did you do? Two options. You either ignored them. Hikrivan b'shnei kelim. You did it anyway in two kelim. Psulim. It's obviously disqualified. Why is it disqualified? Because if it was a different neder, which is what we assumed in the first cases, you could just say it was a different neder. But you should have said so. If people catch you on it and say, what are you doing? You would have said, that was a different vow. I'm fulfilling some other vow right now. But you didn't say that, and you did it anyway wrong. It looks like you didn't care, and you did it wrong anyway, and that's disqualified. But b'kli echad, if you changed your mind, kshirim, and you then put it all in one vessel, or two vessels, depending on the case, it would work. Now, why is that a chiddush? Obviously it worked. You fixed it. But you already put it in a klei sharei incorrectly. So maybe that already ruins it, but they say, no, that doesn't ruin it, because whatever you put in a klei sharei incorrectly, if it was by accident, if you did it incorrectly on purpose, it's ruined. If you did it incorrectly by accident, you can fix that. Now, hare alai, last case in the Mishnah, if you said, upon me is going to be shnei esronot, lahavi b'shnei kelim, to bring in two kelim, vevi b'kli echad, and amrulo, and they said, b'shnei kelim nadarta, but you said two, why'd you put it in one? Again, same thing, hikrivan b'shnei kelim ksherim, if you put them in two different vessels, it'll be ksherim. If you fix it, you can fix it. But this is a little different. Nitano l'kli echad, if you put the two in one vessel, it's not actually ruined, even though, right, you weren't supposed to do it that way. But, because you said two kelim, well, you have a way to do it, b'shnei kelim b'kli echad. What is that? Because in the end, what's the problem? You have to take 2 kometzes. When can you take 2 kometzes? Well, we learned this. If you have 2 menachot that came in the same bowl, you review this as 2 different menachot in the same bowl. Now, remember, if there's a little space between them, they're separated, and you can take a kometz from this one and a kometz from that one on it, and all the doughs are separated, then it's fine. If you can't, then you can't. So then it's like, go see the laws of mincha shenitarvu. Okay, let's finish up. Utsricha. The Gemara says, why did you need both of the first 2 cases? Why do you have to say both machvat marcheshet and 1 kli, 2 kli? It's 2 keli. Because the Iyar Shemainan hach kamaita, if you had the first one about machvat marcheshet, we would say, mishum da amar b'machvat kamaita b'marcheshet, because it's a completely different mincha. And therefore, it's an issue. Aval hacha, the v'idi b'machvat, v'idi b'marcheshet. It's just a matter of how many vessels, but you're doing it in the same way you committed to doing it. Ema yideni dro nami yatzah. Maybe you fulfilled your vow. Right, and then you wouldn't even have to bring a new korban if you said harei alai. What if you only had the second case? Maybe because you split it, and then you have all the problems with the numbers and the amounts and all that. But maybe if there it's all in 1 kli, maybe it doesn't really matter whether you said machvat or chesed and you switched it. Tzricha. That's why you need both cases. We're going to end with this opinion of Rabbi Shimon that we didn't see in the Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, that's what we saw. What you did, but you don't fulfill your neder. Just like, by the way, and we're going to see, just like Rabbi Shimon disagrees there too, in our first Mishnah of our Masechet was you did it shelo lishma, and what did we say? You bring it anyways, this new korban you said, but yedei neder lo yatzah. You didn't fulfill your obligation though, because you did it in the name of the wrong korban. And also there we said that Rabbi Shimon disagrees. If you remember on Daf Bet Amud Bet, it said Rabbi Shimon has a different opinion. Okay, and he says, I'll just read it to you for a minute. It's going to be very similar here. It says the Mishnah maybe isn't like Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon said, because in the end your maasim proof, right? It was, what if you did marchad and you did marcheshet, right? You did it l'shem marcheshet. Since you do it in the end the way you do it, you did it in the end, you said lo lishma, but you did it the right way, your maasim mochichim. So also here he says, Af yedein, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Af yedein nidro nami yatsa. Okay, and he says, okay, and the Rashi quotes it from the beginning of the Masechet, Kviuta de kasavar, kviuta de mana lav klumhu. Okay, putting it in the vessel is not significant. That was one of the explanations we saw to Rabbi Shimon. So what vessel it goes in doesn't really matter in the end. That's what Rabbi Shimon says, and therefore this whole Mishnah is kind of irrelevant. Okay, so he disagrees, and he thinks you can actually fulfill your obligation in that way. With that, we finish for today. Okay, we already kind of summarized the beginning, and we just learned, so I'm not going to summarize. We have the different cases of harei alai, rezo, and whether it's disqualified or not, and then we saw that Rabbi Shimon has a completely different approach, and we saw why we needed to mention each of the separate cases. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.